The porch light trembles over his smile as he shuts the door a little too softly. I stand just inside the entryway, the chill of the night clinging to my skin as though it followed him in, and for a moment the silence between us feels like something alive, waiting, stretching, listening. The cold doorknob presses against my palm as I steady myself, its metal grip sharper than I expect, grounding me in a moment that is strangely fragile despite the ordinary setting. I take in his posture, relaxed shoulders, a muted curve of the lips, an ease that should comfort me, but instead sends the faintest ripple of unease down my spine. The air smells like damp cedar from the porch, a scent carried in with the shifting light that still flickers through the glass panel in the door, casting thin lines across the floor, like hesitant footsteps trying not to be heard. I watch him brush a phantom speck of dust from his shirt sleeve, a gesture so precise and unnecessary that it pulls at something quiet inside me, something alert. He steps deeper into the house, and the porch light continues its soft tremor, creating a fleeting dance of shadows behind him. Shadows that stretch and collapse in uneven rhythms, as though trying to decide whether to follow. My thoughts drift in careful circles, tracing the edges of this moment, wondering why the tremble of a bulb feels heavier than it should, why the softness of the door shutting whispers like a warning instead of a comfort. There is something in the air I can't name, a hollow, that wasn't here earlier in the evening, and though I want to dismiss it as exhaustion or overthinking, the sensation clings stubbornly. He glances back at me briefly, the kind of glance that doesn't linger long enough to reveal anything, and I try to steady my breathing, telling myself I'm simply catching the residue of a long day. Yet the way he moves, too measured, too quiet, keeps tugging at me with invisible fingers, urging my attention toward details I don't yet understand. The faint hum of the refrigerator fills the space between us, a low vibration that feels amplified in the stillness, and outside the porch light continues its quiver, sending shifting reflections across the glass, as if echoing a question I'm not prepared to answer. The thought occurs to me that something about tonight is wrong, subtly but undeniably wrong, and the idea roots itself deeper, despite my attempts to push it aside. He sets his keys on the hallway table, with a soft clatter, the sound startling in the quiet, and the metal rings against the surface in an unsteady rhythm that matches the flickering outside. I take a single step toward him, feeling the wooden floor creak beneath my weight, and the sound seems to ripple through the air, connecting the tremble of the light with the tightening in my chest. It strikes me then that the calm in his expression feels borrowed, as though it belongs to a moment we didn't actually share. I swallow the thought, letting it dissolve before it becomes something I have to acknowledge, and force a slow breath out through my nose, telling myself not to read into the small things that tend to catch my attention. He asks me something simple, how my evening was, whether I remembered to set aside the documents for tomorrow, and his voice carries no edge, no strain, just smooth, practiced ease. I answer quietly, my words steady, but my mind drifting to the sway of the porch light, the cold doorknob still cooling my hand, the sense that something is off kilter. The house feels too neat, too still, as though it's waiting for one of us to disturb the balance. When he moves past me toward the kitchen, I stay where I am, letting the fading warmth of his presence ripple behind him like a draft, and watch the shadows leave him slipping back toward the trembling glow outside. My breathing evens out, but the tension beneath it remains subtle and persistent. I close the door fully, feeling the metal catch against the frame with a soft click, and as I do, the tremor of the porch light shivers across the glass one last time before settling into a dim, steady glow. The shift feels significant in a way I can't justify, like a breath held too long, finally released into the cold night air. I turn toward the living room, moving slowly, as though I'm walking through a memory instead of a moment happening in real time. And the warmth of the house begins to wrap around me again, trying to ease the strange chill lingering in my thoughts. He speaks again from the kitchen, something mundane about tomorrow's schedule, but the words drift toward me without anchoring, floating past like loose threads I don't bother to pull. I catch the faintest reflection of myself in the glass panel of the door, just a blurred outline softened by the settling light, and for reasons I can't explain. The sight steadies me. The moment stretches neither peaceful nor tense, just suspended in a quiet I don't yet understand, but feel deeply. Somewhere between the fading tremor of that light and the steady hum of the house, I sense the first shift in the ground beneath us. Something in the silence waits, already holding its breath. I'm Claire Hensley, 34, a paralegal from Portland, and I remember the morning after with a clarity that still feels cold along the edges. The house smelled faintly of the lavender detergent my mother always used, a scent that clung stubbornly to the scarf draped over the back of the chair, as if she had only stepped out for a moment, instead of being gone forever. I moved slowly through the kitchen, letting the quiet settle into my bones, trying to decide whether the heaviness in my chest came from grief or from the strange undercurrent in Mark's behavior the night before. Steam curled from my coffee mug as I picked up a small dustpan from the counter, the one I'd left there after dropping a picture frame 2 days earlier. A single mirror shard remained on the floor, where I'd missed it, catching the early light just right, so that a thin shard of illumination blurred across its cracked surface. That soft, wavering glimmer held my eye longer than it should have. I crouched down and lifted the shard carefully between my fingers, feeling the tension of glass against skin. The light wavered over my thumb in a way that made the moment feel more delicate than it deserved, as though the house were trying to tell me something I wasn't yet ready to hear. Mark's footsteps sounded upstairs, slow, even practiced, and each one carried the memory of the porch light trembling behind him the night before. I held the fragment of glass a moment longer, turning it gently to watch the reflection slide across its surface like something trying to escape. It reminded me of how he'd avoided my eyes when he asked about my evening, how his voice had felt too calm, too aligned, as if rehearsed. I told myself it was nothing, that my mind was frayed from grief and from navigating the paperwork that had swallowed my life after the funeral. Still, the sensations threaded themselves through the morning with quiet insistence. When I placed the mirror shard on the counter, my hand hesitated, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that I felt the moment bend slightly, as if realizing an invisible shift. I reached for my phone to check the time and saw a brief message from Jenna. "Don't forget we need the deposition notes today. Call if you need help." Her kindness settled more warmly than the coffee did. I answered her with a quick thanks and set the phone down beside the shard, noticing how the screen's reflection wavered against the fractured surface. Mark came downstairs, then his footsteps aligning too neatly with the creak of the third stair, a detail I'd grown used to, yet now heard differently. He greeted me with a soft voice, the kind he used when he wanted to signal everything was fine. I nodded, answered, smiled, a little habitual motions that didn't quite feel real. But the way he lingered near the doorway, watching me with an expression that looked almost like calculation pressed against something inside me I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. He asked if I'd slept, if I wanted him to pick anything up on his way home later, if I needed him to call the lawyer again about the estate forms. Each question was appropriate, thoughtful, even, but something in the cadence struck me as slightly out of step, like a song played with one wrong note that only becomes noticeable when repeated. I told him I was fine. He nodded slowly, his gaze flickering just once toward the shard on the counter. I followed his eyes and realized the shard still pulled a shimmer of light across the smooth surface, reflecting a distorted sliver of my face. I reached for it, intending to drop it into the trash, but instead found myself placing it carefully into the small drawer beside the sink. The hesitation came again, that subtle tightening in my chest, as though the moment resisted closure. I shut the drawer slowly, feeling the quiet slide of wood against wood, and when I turned back toward Mark, he already had his jacket draped over his arm, his expression unreadable. He said he was leaving early, had a meeting to prepare for, and I nodded again, unable to shake the sense that the morning was slipping sideways in ways I couldn't articulate. His hand brushed the doorway as he passed, and for just an instant he paused, barely perceptible, before stepping through. The hesitation was small, but it marked the air like the faint scratch of a needle on vinyl. I stayed still long after the sound of his car faded down the street, letting the silence braid itself into the room. My hand drifted to the drawer where the mirror shard rested. Something about the act of placing it there, hidden but not gone, felt strangely significant, as though I'd tucked away a question instead of an object. I stood in the kitchen a while longer, tracing the scent of my mother's scarf in the air, telling myself the shift I sensed had nothing to do with Mark, that it was only the weight of loss pressing its slow, familiar ache against me. But even then, quiet, tired, holding a cooling mug of coffee, I felt it a small, almost imperceptible distortion in the lines of my life, an early fracture waiting for the right angle of light to reveal itself. Every detail seemed to hover just outside understanding, like a reflection bending toward a truth I wasn't prepared to face. The drawer with the shard settles shut, but the unease refuses to follow. The morning light stretched thin across the kitchen tiles. As I sorted through Mark's jacket pockets, searching for a pen he claimed he'd misplaced, telling myself I wasn't really looking for anything else. The fabric felt heavier than usual, cold along the seams, and when my fingers brushed the crumpled receipt at the bottom of the pocket, I hesitated. It was small, unremarkable, the kind of thing most people toss without thinking, yet something about the stiffness of the paper made me slide it out slowly, as if removing a splinter. The paper edge caught the side of my finger, slicing just enough to sting, and I watched a thin bead of red rise as though the moment itself wanted to mark me. I pressed my thumb against the cut, steadying my breath, and turned the receipt toward the light. Ref W732. The timestamp printed at the bottom, 9:14 p.m., 2 nights ago. The night he said he'd been working late. The night he'd come home quieter than usual, brushing past me with a strained smile before retreating upstairs. I stared at the numbers, as though they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense, but the ink held firm. A timestamp can't lie. I told myself, though I knew people could. People often did. Sometimes subtly, sometimes brazenly. Sometimes with a soft, door-shutting gesture that echoed long after the sound faded. The reflection of the window wavered across the surface of the paper, smearing the printed lines into an indistinct blur for a moment, before sharpening again. I placed the receipt on the counter, beside the small droplet of blood that had fallen from my finger, the red dot, blooming gently like a punctuation mark, in a sentence I hadn't finished reading. My thoughts drifted back to the way he'd stood in the doorway last night, his posture too controlled, his eyes too far away. It felt like a memory refracted through water, true, but warped, familiar, but unsteady. I heard his voice echo faintly in my mind, the way he'd said he was exhausted, the way he'd touched my shoulder lightly before moving past me, as though I were a piece of furniture he needed to navigate around. The contradiction between his claimed schedule and the printed timestamp settled into my chest. Not heavy exactly, but sharp, precise. A small early crack forming. I rinsed my cut under cold water, watching the red swirl away from my skin, and turned the receipt over again. The address at the top wasn't anywhere near his office. It was across town, tucked near a strip of restaurants, and a dimly lit bar I knew he used to frequent with coworkers long before my mother became sick. I tried to tell myself there were reasonable explanations, that maybe he'd stopped to grab something to eat. Maybe he'd forgotten to mention it, but the idea felt flimsy, lacking the weight needed to hold back the unease that crept along the edges of my thoughts. I folded the receipt once, then again, the crisp lines forming neat angles before placing it on the counter with deliberate care. The window's reflection swallowed the small piece of paper for a moment, pulling it into a shifting pattern of light that made it look almost insignificant, almost ignorable. Almost. I stepped back, letting the kitchen settle into its soft morning quiet, the refrigerator humming in the background like a low, constant reminder that life moves steadily, even when truth stutters. I thought about asking him directly about holding up the receipt and watching his expression change, but the idea of confrontation felt too sudden, too raw. Instead, I sat down at the table and let my fingers drift along the grain of the wood, tracing small imperfections I'd never noticed before. The receipt lay there silent and unmoving, but its presence shifted the room as surely as if the walls had leaned closer to listen. I wondered then whether this was the first crack, or simply the first one I'd been willing to see. When I finally stood the light from the window, bent at just the right angle to catch the folded paper perfectly reflecting its shape back at me, with a clarity that felt more like accusation than illumination. The reflection tightens around the numbers, refusing to let them fade. The evening air pressed cool against my skin as I stepped outside the dim lamp on Evelyn's porch, casting a soft yellow halo across the walkway. Mark stood a few feet ahead, speaking in low-clipped tones with his boss, Peter Lawson. The lamplight wavered across Peter's face, catching the tightness around his eyes, and I felt an unmistakable tension lingering between them, a tension that didn't belong to casual workplace talk. My footsteps on the gravel drew both of their attention, but Mark's reaction landed first, a smile too quick, too thin, as if stretched over something sharp beneath it. The dim lamp flickered behind me, echoing the trembling porch light from nights prior, and the half-closed door light effect from Peter's raised phone screen cut a narrow line across Mark's jaw, highlighting the stiffness there. Peter shifted uneasily as I approached, glancing between us, with the cautious look of someone who knew more than he wanted to admit. In his hand, the phone's glow illuminated an email, subject status update, Ref LX 204, with a date that didn't match anything Mark had told me. I froze for a moment, recognizing enough of the message to understand that it wasn't simply routine correspondence. The reflection of the screen shimmered across Peter's glasses before he tucked the phone slightly toward himself, and Mark's jaw tightened, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to me. Evelyn stood at the edge of her porch watering her plants, but her attention lingered our way. The public nature of the scene pressed in, making every movement feel observed, exposed. I tried to keep my voice steady as I greeted them, but something in Mark's eyes flashed annoyance or fear I couldn't tell. He brushed off my presence with a polished calm, stepping subtly between me and Peter. But the gesture felt too intentional, too protective of the very thing he didn't want me to see. The dim lamp above Evelyn flickered again, a soft tremor that skimmed across the walkway and landed on the metal edge of Peter's phone, reflecting a sliver of light that seemed to point directly at Mark. Peter cleared his throat, offering me a polite greeting tinged with hesitation. His posture carried the weight of someone holding information he had not planned to reveal in public, and his eyes drifted once, just once, toward Mark's expression, as if silently urging him to explain something. Mark didn't. Instead, he deflected with a shallow laugh, one that held none of the warmth a husband's voice should carry, especially not toward a grieving wife. The sound struck me in the chest with a quiet cruelty, echoing the memory of the way he laughed the day my mother died. I took a small step closer, feeling the rough texture of the walkway beneath my shoes, and the shadows from the lamp stretched long across Peter's shoulder. The air smelled faintly of soil, and evening rain grounding me as the truth hovered close enough to touch. Evelyn paused, her watering offering a soft evening glare. Her tone edged with concern she tried to mask. Her presence amplified the public weight of the moment, making Mark's discomfort more visible. I looked at his face carefully, arranged politely, indifferent, and saw the fracture beneath the surface widening. He shifted again too quickly, blocking my sightline to Peter's phone entirely. The gesture confirmed something I hadn't dared to believe: he was guarding the truth, and not for my sake. Peter exhaled quietly, as if surrendering to a decision he hadn't intended to make. The lamplight caught the worry in his eyes, and I realized he knew exactly what he was stepping into. He opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to warn, but Mark cut him off with a curt, controlled tone that rang too loud against the stillness. The interruption hung in the air like a sharp edge. In that suspended moment, the light from Evelyn's porch trembled again, and Peter's uneasy silence told me more than Mark ever had. The glow from Peter's phone lingers behind my eyes long after he turns it away. The bedroom was still wrapped in the quiet haze of early morning when I pulled open the half-open drawer, its wooden edge catching faint light from the blinds and forming narrow slashes across the floor. I hadn't meant to search through anything, I told myself that repeatedly, But the drawer's stubborn tilt refusing to close the night before had lingered in my mind like a whisper I couldn't ignore. Inside Mark's phone lay at an odd angle screen, faintly warm, as if it had only recently been set down. My fingers hovered above it, not touching, just absorbing the unease that pulsed faintly from the sight of it resting there so unguarded. I shifted slightly, and the light shifted with me, casting the drawer's shadow longer, making it resemble something pried open by invisible hands. I told myself to step back, to leave it alone, to let the moment pass without pulling on the thread that had been tugging at me for days. But the thread didn't loosen. It pulled tighter. When I reached for the phone, I didn't unlock it. I didn't need to. The recent call log glowed faintly on the screen, having reopened from some background action I didn't fully understand. The last call listed was his time-stamped at 03:17 a.m., a missing minute. I stared at it, brows tightening, recalling how he'd insisted he'd been asleep by midnight, how he'd barely looked up when I'd asked about his strange restlessness. He hadn't stuttered, hadn't hesitated, hadn't offered even the smallest sign of uncertainty. Yet here was the missing minute carved cleanly out of the night like a secret he didn't think would matter. My pulse thudded quietly in my ears as a memory surfaced. His hand tremoring slightly when he reached for his coat yesterday, the tremor he'd laughed off with a casual remark about caffeine. I replayed the moment now, the way his smile had lifted only one corner of his mouth, the way his eyes had flicked away from mine. None of it had seemed important at the time. All of it felt important now. I placed the phone back exactly where it had been, careful not to disturb its angle, as though the drawer itself were watching me. The blinds shifted again with a passing breeze, scattering the light into fractured lines that stretched across the carpet. The half-open drawer seemed to inhale the light, holding it in a thin, uneasy glow. I moved my fingers along its wooden edge, feeling the grain beneath my skin, grounding myself against the swell of questions rising quietly but firmly. And then something sharper hit me, the echo of how he'd laughed the day my mother collapsed, the way he'd shrugged off my trembling voice when I tried to explain what the doctor had said. A coldness bit at the center of my ribs at the memory, and I pushed it back down, refusing to let it swallow the moment whole. The phone screen dimmed to black, its reflection catching my face in a distorted shimmer. I stepped back slowly, letting the drawer remain open just a fraction, as if the space itself had chosen its position and I was only a witness. The missing minute hung in the air, with the quiet weight of a confession not yet spoken. I pressed my palm flat against the surface of the dresser, grounding myself again, and breathed deeply through the unease stirring low in my chest. No matter how gently I tried to dismiss it, the truth inside that drawer had already begun to take shape. The drawer's shadow stretches farther than it should, refusing to fall still. The flickering bulb above the entryway stuttered in the dim afternoon light as I stood beneath it, its unsteady glow scattering fragments of shadow across the narrow hallway like pieces of a truth I wasn't ready to gather. And for a moment, I simply watched the way each pulse of brightness fractured the space around me, how the light broke and reformed as though trying to mirror the uncertainty tightening inside my chest. I held my phone loosely in my hand, the small screen reflecting my faint outline, and when I opened the door, cam clip Ref D11. The frame jerked once before settling into an image warped slightly at the edges. The hallway on the recording wasn't mine, not entirely. The house looked the same, the time of night the same, but the timestamp in the lower corner read something that didn't match reality, 8:42 p.m., the night Mark swore he'd been finishing a report 2 miles away. Light fractures again, when the bulb flickers over the distorted frame, the image splitting into 2 overlapping versions, for a breath-long second, as if the truth itself were caught between appearances. I replayed the clip, then again, each time watching that glitch pulse across the screen like a heartbeat out of rhythm, a beat that didn't belong to the house, but to him, to the lie, forming slowly across the timeline of our marriage. The hallway on the recording held shadows I didn't recognize, thin lines stretching across the floor at unfamiliar angles, and as the flickering bulb overhead trembled once more, I felt the weight of those shadows settle into my spine. There was no reason for the timestamp to be wrong. The camera was hardwired, dependable, untouched. Yet the moment the glitch hit the camera's reflection, caught Mark's silhouette in a way that didn't match the story he'd told me about where he'd been, who he was with what he was doing. I tightened my grip on the phone, listening to the faint hum of the bulb above me, the hum that grew louder each time the light faltered, and I felt the familiar chill of the house wrap around me, a cold that wasn't physical but mental creeping in through the realization that what I'd tried so hard to dismiss had begun to root itself in hard evidence. The clip jumped forward by a fraction of a second every time I tapped the screen, skipping just enough to make the truth feel slippery evasive. Yet the timestamp stayed steady in its wrongness, fixed at 8:42 in a night that he'd described differently. My breath tightened as the reflection from the phone's surface struck me at an odd angle, casting my face into a distorted outline that blurred at the edges, echoing how the image on the cam stuttered around his figure. And then, as if the moment had been waiting for my attention, the bulb above me faltered, in a long, drawn-out flicker, stretching the shadows across the hallway, until they merged into a single wavering shape that seemed to point directly at the phone in my hand. In that quivering circle of dim yellow light, the contradiction stopped being a suspicion and became a fact I could no longer soften with excuses. I leaned against the wall, letting the cold of the paint seep through the thin fabric of my shirt, grounding myself as I studied the clip once more. The camera angle captured only part of him, just the shoulder and the side of his arm. But even that small glimpse held an unmistakable tension. The lift of his elbows, the slight hunch of his shoulders, the hurried tilt of his head movements of someone not coming home from work, but bracing against the weight of whatever he carried outside the frame. Lightning cracked faintly somewhere in the distance, or maybe it was just the bulb stuttering again, but the sound vibrated through the hallway, blurring the line between outside and inside, echoing the dissonance forming inside me. My mind drifted to the receipt with the wrong timestamp, the missing minute on his phone at 03:17, the way he'd shifted when Peter pulled up that email in the lamplight, and the sound of his laugh the night my mother died, too sharp, too effortless, too cruel for a moment, that should have demanded tenderness. Each memory folded itself into the present, arranging in a quiet sequence of moments that no longer felt disconnected. The pattern grew clearer with each breath. The recording wasn't just a glitch, it was an anchor pulling everything else into alignment. I tried replaying the video in slow motion, watching the frame shiver as the door cam attempted to stabilize itself. The reflection in the glass panel of the door appeared beside him for a fraction of a second, a warped, duplicated silhouette, almost like the house itself was trying to reveal more than he had intended to be seen. I swallowed hard, pushing the air out of my lungs in a slow, shuddering breath, and let the truth settle into the spaces between the fractured reflections on the screen. The bulb flickered again, casting a ripple of shadow over my hand, and I felt the moment tip forward in a way that felt irreversible. I stepped away from the hallway into the living room, the soft scrape of my steps sounding unnaturally loud, and sank onto the edge of the couch, still holding the phone. The clip replayed itself one more time, unprompted, as though the device had taken it upon itself to insist I look again. The timestamp remained firm, glowing in quiet defiance of the lie he had told me. I let my eyes close for a moment, not to escape, but to gather myself to brace against the realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a benign error. It was something deeper, darker, threaded through with intent. When I opened my eyes, the reflection from the darkened television screen showed me sitting still. Phone in hand, the flickering light above the hallway trembling in the background, like a silent metronome, marking the beat of a truth finally exposed. Somewhere between the unsteady glow of that bulb and the frozen frame of the cam, the lie he'd built began to collapse. The next flicker of light lands like a warning I can't unsee. The trembling key lay in my palm, like a small, restless creature, its metal edge tapping lightly against my skin, each time my hand shifted, as if urging me toward a truth I had gone too long without facing. I stood in the doorway of the office break room, the fluorescent lights above humming in their usual flat monotone. But today, even that hum felt sharper, more pointed. Jenna's message from earlier, "I found something you need to see," still echoed in my mind as I stepped inside. The room was sparsely occupied, just a couple of coworkers murmuring at the far table. But the ashtray on the counter caught my attention immediately, the way its glass surface reflected the overhead lights in fractured little bursts. It reminded me of the mirror shard I had tucked away at home, of the way reflections kept finding me, as though they were stitching my suspicions into something tangible, undeniable. Jenna stood near the back of the room, her shoulders drawn tight as she hovered beside the small monitor connected to the office's security system. When she met my gaze, something in her expression softened with concern. She motioned me closer with a quick tilt of her head, and I tightened my grip on the trembling key as I approached, feeling the weight of the last weeks pressing against my ribs. "I'm not sure what this means," she whispered, clicking into a still frame frozen on the screen. "But I thought you should know." The image sharpened into view, frame 14B, a grainy shot of a dim hallway late evening, and in the center of it Mark. His body angled away from the camera, his face partially obscured by shadow, but it was unmistakably him. The timestamp burned clearly above his outline, revealing a late hour he had never once mentioned, a night he had claimed to be home early, helping me sort through my mother's documents. I stared at the screen, my breath slowing to a measured, almost unnatural rhythm. The trembling key pressed harder into my palm, as if reacting to the growing tension within me. Where is this?" My voice sounded thin, pulled taut by the strain of trying to keep it steady. Jenna bit her lip and glanced again at the still frame. "Second floor hallway, near the conference wing." This was after most people had already left. Her shoulders tightened again, and she lowered her voice. "Claire?" He shouldn't have been here that night. She didn't have to say the rest. I already knew. The pieces had been forming their own shape since the receipt in Part 3, since the timestamp glitch in Part 6, since the way he blocked Peter's phone from my sight in Part 4. As though truth was light, he needed to shield from me. I leaned closer to the screen, studying every pixel, the slight blur around his shoes, the faint shadow stretching behind him, the angle of his shoulders. His posture was tense, braced the posture of someone caught between leaving and hiding. A movement behind me caused me to straighten. One of our co-workers had wandered closer, idly pouring coffee, but their eyes flicked toward the screen just long enough to widen with recognition. The public weight of the moment settled in heavier than I expected. Exposure wasn't a concept anymore, it was happening here in the quiet hum of the break room beneath the flickering edge of fluorescent light. Jenna cleared her throat, clicking the image back to the archive menu. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice thick with sincerity. "I just didn't want you to be blindsided later." I felt something shift inside me. Not a collapse, not quite clarity yet, but a tilt, a decisive movement toward a truth I could no longer step around. My fingers curled around the trembling key, the metal warming slowly against my skin, as though storing the heat of everything the moment demanded I acknowledge. "Thank you," I whispered, forcing the words past the pressure building in my chest. She nodded, expression tight with empathy, and stepped away, giving me space to breathe, space to absorb the image still lingering behind my eyelids. I set the key down on the counter, feeling its slight rattle as it made contact with the surface, and stared at the reflection it cast beneath the fluorescent lights. The reflection trembled with the rhythm of the lights, echoing the motif that had followed me from mirror shard to flickering bulb, from trembling porch light to distorted cam footage. Each reflection had shown me something incomplete, partial refracted, and yet somehow each had been pointing toward the same quiet truth. I inhaled deeply, letting the stale office air fill my lungs, then picked up the key again and closed my fingers firmly around it. The reassurance that small object once offered belonging home stability felt unfamiliar, now replaced with an unsettling awareness that what it unlocked was no longer a sanctuary, but a collection of shadows I had been avoiding. As I turned to leave the break room, I caught sight of my faint silhouette in the glass of the vending machine. There was something steadier about it now, something resolved, and I realized I had stopped making excuses, stopped cushioning the truth with softer possibilities. The hallway outside was quieter than usual, a soft echo of footsteps far down the corridor, mixing with the muted hum of the air conditioning. I walked slowly, feeling the cool tile beneath my shoes, each step carrying me deeper into understanding. When I reached the stairwell, I paused, listening to the faint sway of the door on its hinge. The key weighed heavy in my pocket, now heavier than its size, justified, as though it knew it represented more than an entryway. It symbolized the threshold between who I had been and who I was becoming. I exhaled steadily, letting the breath sink into the echoing space, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something inside me shift into alignment. The evidence wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a confirmation, a truth made visible under stark fluorescent lighting witnessed by more than just myself, anchored in digital stillness. I stepped into the stairwell, my footsteps echoing softly as I descended the trembling key, clinking lightly against my leg with each movement. The sound folded itself into the building's quiet, steady rhythm, marking the start of a new awareness, a new direction I could no longer avoid. And as I reached the bottom step, the truth sharpened, finally settling into place. With an unmistakable weight, whatever Mark was hiding had grown too large to remain in shadow. The hallway in that still frame follows me long after I leave the room. Rain hammered the roof in a steady, relentless rhythm as I stepped into the living room, Mark's coat draped over my arm, the fabric soaked through and cold enough to sting my skin. The storm outside cast shifting shadows across the floor, reflections bending and stretching with every flash of distant lightning, as if the house itself were breathing unevenly. I laid the coat across the back of the couch, intending only to let it dry. But the moment my fingers brushed the inner pocket, something inside crinkled, a faint, unmistakable sound that rooted me to the spot. I hesitated, my pulse tightening, and slowly reached inside. My fingertips found the edge of a folded slip of paper, damp from the rain, but intact, and when I pulled it free, the air around me seemed to still. The slip trembled slightly between my fingers as I unfolded it, the rainwater bleeding the ink just enough to smudge the edges, but not enough to hide the truth printed clearly in the center, a late-night bank withdrawal account ending. Time-stamped at an hour, he claimed he'd been asleep beside me. A cold wave moved through my chest, not sudden, but deep, sinking like a stone hitting the bottom of a well. I read the timestamp again, hoping for a misunderstanding. A logical explanation, something benign, but the numbers remained fixed, immovable. The storm outside cracked with a roll of thunder that vibrated through the window pane, scattering a distorted pattern of reflections across the floorboards. Those reflections stretched toward the bank, slip in my hand, fractured shapes that echoed every motif that had followed me. The mirror shard in part 2, the receipt in part 3, the dim lamp's trembling glow in part 4. The half-open drawer in part 5, the flickering bulb in part 6, the trembling key in part 7. Each moment had felt like a warning, whispered through reflections and shadows, and now those warnings aligned into perfect, unmistakable clarity. My breath tightened as I lowered myself onto the edge of the couch, the rain-wet sleeve of Mark's coat brushing against my wrist with a cold, accusatory cling. The fabric stuck to my skin, as though trying to anchor me in this revelation, refusing to let me look away. I stared at the slip again, feeling the room tilt under the weight of what it confirmed. This wasn't a minor inconsistency. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was deliberate. He had taken money out late at night. He had lied about where he'd been. He had built a timeline so fragile it shattered under the simplest light. My mind drifted back through the weeks, his laughter the night my mother collapsed, his dismissive tone at the funeral, the soft door-shutting gestures that had felt too practiced, the way he blocked Peter's phone in part 4, as if shielding the truth as naturally as breathing. With each memory, the pieces of him I had tried so hard to protect, to excuse, to bend toward benefit of the doubt, began to unspool. I pressed the slip flat against my knee, smoothing the edges with trembling fingers. The storm outside pressed harder, its reflection sliding across the hardwood like a restless tide. Lightning lit the room in a brief white flash, revealing the distorted shimmer of water collecting beneath the drying coat. The wet fabric caught the light in a warped, rippling reflection that seemed to echo the moment my denial cracked. I stood slowly, the bank slip still in my hand, and walked toward the doorway. The air felt different here, heavier like a threshold between what I'd tried not to see and what I could no longer ignore. I glanced back at the coat. As thunder boomed again, the rain-wet sleeve pointing slightly toward the bank slip, as though the fabric itself wanted to confess. My mother's scarf hung nearby, still carrying her fading scent, warm, familiar, honest, and for a moment, the contrast between her authenticity and Mark's growing web of deceit hit me with a quiet ferocity. I inhaled deeply, letting the scent settle around me like a last gentle reminder of someone whose presence had never required questioning. Then I turned back to the slip, reading it for the 4th time, the 5th, the 6th. The numbers didn't waver. The truth refused to soften. I replayed every detail. The timestamp glitch on the door cam, the receipts cut on my finger, the missing minute at 03:17, the CCTV still. Jenna had shown me the pieces building toward this moment, like a puzzle assembling itself in reverse. I pressed my thumb against the slip, grounding myself. Why? The word didn't leave my lips aloud, but it formed inside me, quiet and steady, not desperate but resolute. I didn't need the answer yet. I only needed to accept that a question existed, and that acceptance, fragile as it felt, marked the beginning of something irreversible. I walked toward the window, watching the rain smear the city lights into streaks of silver and gold. The reflections looked distorted, as if the world outside was struggling to hold its own shape, mirroring how I felt, bent but not broken. The truth was no longer hiding in shadows. It stood beside me now, undeniable. And denial, my greatest flaw, finally loosened its grip. In the slanting rainlight pooling across the floor, I felt the moment shift. This was no longer suspicion. It was confirmation. The house breathed quietly around me, the storm whispering against the glass, and I realized that everything beyond this point would move differently. Every step, every choice, every word. The wet fabric against my skin feels like a truth refusing to dry. The house felt too quiet as I moved from room to room, the air thick with the weight of everything I had uncovered, and with each step, the distorted shimmer of reflections followed me on the darkened window, on the glossy surface of the table, on the faint glint of the picture frames, echoes of the glass reflection that had anchored so many moments before this one. I paced slowly, the voicemail fragment still warm in my hand from when I had replayed it for the 5th, maybe 6th time, the timestamp glowing faintly, 22:41. The message had come through the backup retrieval on my phone, one of those overlooked features that resurrect fragments people think they've erased for good, and when I pressed play the first time, the clipped breath on the other end had made me freeze, the kind of breath people take right before saying something they shouldn't. Then came Peter's voice, strained low as though he had been speaking in a place where truth wasn't meant to be heard. "She deserves to know," he had said before, the audio fractured into static and cut out entirely. No background noises, no identifiers, just that one sentence lifting the floor beneath me. I stood in the center of the living room, now facing the window, the rain from earlier, leaving the glass streaked with wavering lines that bent my reflection into something thinner, sharper. The apartment lights cast a dim glow across the hardwood, producing scattered reflections that seemed to carry their own quiet tension. I pressed my palm against the cool surface of the table, anchoring myself, breathing slowly, as my thoughts began winding themselves into a shape I could finally see clearly. Whatever Mark had woven, whatever lies he'd balanced with the ease of a practiced storyteller, were collapsing under the pressure of this new piece of evidence. The voicemail wasn't about a disagreement or a missed detail. It was about a truth being withheld, one so significant that Peter, a man who barely spoke above a murmur at work, had felt compelled to say those words at all. I lifted the phone again, the screen's glow casting a pale reflection on my fingertips, and replayed the fragment, listening closely to every syllable, every breath. The distortion at the end wasn't random. It sounded like abrupt interference, as though someone had interrupted him or he'd stopped himself. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the house wrapped in a stillness that felt louder than any storm, and in that stillness I felt the edges of my denial fall away completely. I walked toward the hallway mirror, the object in part 9, the glass reflection catching me before I reached it. My silhouette elongated, bends and angles forming a vague shape before sharpening as I drew closer. Standing there watching the fractured version of myself settle into clarity, I felt something inside me align with a quiet click, almost like a lock turning. The reflection showed not just my face, but the exhaustion that had threaded itself through me for weeks. The grief softened into a steady ache, and beneath it all, a burgeoning resolve. I remembered the look in Mark's eyes when he'd brushed past me earlier that morning, the dismissal, the slight recoil when I reached out to steady his coat, as though my touch carried a truth he wasn't ready to face. I blinked once, steadying the rhythm of my breathing, and lowered myself onto the couch, letting the room shift around me with the soft hum of the refrigerator somewhere in the distance. The voicemail's implications spiraled into every other unanswered question. The receipt with its wrong timestamp, the missing minute at 03:17, the glitching door cam at 8:42, the trembling key in part 7. The bank withdrawal at an hour. He shouldn't have been conscious, the email he never meant for me to see. Every detail had been a thread, and now the threads intertwined into something undeniable. I rubbed my thumb across the back of the phone, as though smoothing the sharp corners of the truth, feeling the heaviness settle into my limbs, not paralyzing but clarifying. There was no part of this that could be explained away anymore. No version of reality where coincidence stitched these pieces together so neatly. I pushed myself upright slowly, the movement soft but deliberate, and crossed the room to the dining table where the receipt and bank slip lay side by side, silent witnesses to the unraveling truth. The voicemail, though short, was the keystone that made the contradictions fall into place with devastating clarity. Peter's voice had carried not fear exactly, but resignation, the tone of someone who had waited too long to speak. My reflection from the window's surface followed me as I paced, bending and reshaping with every turn I made. I tried to imagine the moment Peter recorded that voicemail, where he had been standing, what expression he'd worn, what pressure he had been under, and the image that formed was dark, heavy, lit by artificial light that cast long shadows behind him. The kind of shadows people only stand in when they know something is wrong. I stopped pacing and pressed my fingertips lightly to the table, letting the wood steady me. My voice, when I finally spoke aloud, was soft, almost a whisper, but firm, with the kind of truth I could no longer avoid. He's been lying to me. Saying it didn't shatter anything. It simply set the truth into its rightful place. I lifted my gaze to the window again, and this time, the reflection staring back held something steadier, something ready. The voicemail clip chimed again as it timed out on the screen, and I felt the shift inside me land fully. Whatever happened next would begin with confronting him. No more shadows, no more softening, no more excuses. The reflection in the window steadies, holding a truth I'm finally ready to face. The lobby of Mark's building felt colder than the weather outside when I stepped through the sliding glass doors. The kind of cold that came from polished stone floors and two bright overhead lights rather than the wind. The reception desk gleamed under the glare, and the glass walls reflected everything back at me, in duplicate my own face, pale and set. The revolving door spinning behind me. The scattered clusters of employees moving slowly through the space, as if time here operated on its own careful schedule. I spotted Peter near the far end of the lobby, standing by a column with his phone in his hand, the screen's glow casting a pale strip of light along his cheek. It was a small detail, but the sight of it made my stomach twist. Light on a face had never felt so loaded. I walked toward him, feeling every step land heavier than it should, the echo of my heels on the stone sounding louder than the quiet conversations around us. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment his expression flickered, not surprise exactly, but resignation, like a man who had known this moment would arrive and dreaded it anyway. "Claire," he said softly, adjusting his grip on the phone, the glow shifting along his jawline. I stopped a few feet away, leaving a polite distance between us that felt absurdly formal, considering what I had come here to hear. "You left me a voicemail," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You said I deserved to know." His gaze dropped briefly to the floor, then returned to mine with a weight that made my pulse thrum at the base of my throat. Nearby, a security guard leaned against the wall, watching the flow of people, and a pair of co-workers paused at the edge of the lobby cafe, their conversation slowing as they noticed us. This wasn't a private conversation. The space itself refused to let it be one. Peter exhaled, then gestured with his phone. "We should sit," he murmured, but I shook my head. I didn't want the comfort of a chair of any softness that might tempt me to retreat. I wanted the hardness of this floor, the brightness of these lights, the witnesses who would see what unfolded. "Tell me here," I said quietly. The phone's light brightened as he unlocked it, and the glow deepened along his cheek, making the angles of his face look sharper, more haunted. He tapped a few times, then turned the screen toward me. A spreadsheet filled the display columns of dates, times, badge numbers, door names. The header read, "Access Log Ref A19. One line was highlighted in a pale strip of blue. "This is from the night your mother collapsed," he said slowly. "He told you he stayed late for a client call, that he didn't see any messages until afterwards." My eyes traced the line. Mark's badge ID, the one I'd seen on his work lanyard countless times. Time, 18:07 exit. Location door 3B, East Garage. Another line earlier that afternoon, 16:42 entry. There was no record of him staying late. No record of him even being inside when he said he was on that call. I swallowed my throat suddenly too tight. So where was he? The words scraped their way out. Peter glanced around the lobby, then back at me. The security guard's attention had shifted subtly in our direction, and a few people walking by slowed just enough to listen without stopping. This was a public scene now, whether any of us liked it or not. In that bright rectangle of the lobby, his lie finally had a shape, a time, and a witness. Peter lowered his voice, but not enough to keep it from carrying. "He left before 5, he said. He went to the bar across the street. I know because I was there. We'd both had a long week, and he said he needed to celebrate a break from the drama at home." My stomach turned. The word drama hung in the air like something toxic. "You mean my mother dying?" I said, and my voice didn't crack the way I thought it might. It came out level cold. He closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. "Yes." The lobby seemed to tighten around us. I could feel eyes on my back now. A receptionist pretending to straighten a stack of papers. The security guard standing a little straighter, a pair of employees lingering too long near the entrance. Peter continued, his voice roughening with memory. He said she'd been sick for so long that it almost felt like a relief, that maybe when the hospital finally called it would free up your life. My chest went hollow. The reflections on the glass walls, on the shiny floors, on the chrome railings, all of them seemed to blur for a second, then snap back into focus sharper than before. I remembered the exact moment I'd told Mark my mother's heart had finally stopped, how he'd laughed under his breath and called it the inevitable finally catching up. I had told myself I'd misheard. That grief had twisted the moment into something worse in my memory. I stared at Peter, waiting, knowing there was more. He swallowed hard. "He joked," Peter said quietly, his gaze dropping to the phone still glowing between us. "When I asked if you were okay, he said you were milking it, that you'd been using her illness as an excuse not to move on with your life." He laughed when he said it. The air in my lungs felt like glass, each breath threatening to cut from the inside. The lobby sounds dulled around the edges. Distant footsteps, the faint ping of the elevator, the low hum of conversation, but one detail remained piercingly clear. The light from Peter's phone, resting along his cheek, framing the truth he had just delivered. My mother had died, and my husband had gone to a bar to celebrate the quiet, He thought it would bring him. He had laughed. He had dismissed my grief as inconvenience. He had framed my love for the woman who raised me as a burden he wanted lifted. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shut off the screen. The light vanished from his face, leaving his features in the flat glow of the lobby. "Because I watched you stand at the funeral and apologize for not being there sooner," he said. "Because I knew he'd told you the hospital couldn't reach him, that his phone was dead, and he was trapped in a late meeting." He shook his head once sharply. "I watched him lie to your face, and I told myself it wasn't my business. But when he asked me to adjust his timesheet afterwards to make it look like he'd stayed late for a client call, I realized it was. The access log, the bar, the laughter, the timesheet. It all folded together into a single suffocating image, my husband drink in hand, eyes bright with the thrill of freedom. Laughing about the call from the hospital, he let ring through while my mother's chest rose and fell for the last time, without me there. Hearing how he laughed about my dying mother cracked something in me that will never mend the same. I didn't look away from Peter. I couldn't. My voice felt like it belonged to someone else when I spoke again. "Did anyone else hear him?" He nodded once. "2 guys from accounting," he said. "They're not here right now, but they heard." The security guard shifted his white eyes, briefly meeting mine before flicking away. A woman near the elevator pretended to be absorbed in her phone, but hadn't pressed any buttons. The truth had not just landed between us. It had spilled into the open, into the lobby, into the reflective surfaces, catching every angle of my reaction. I stood a little straighter, feeling the ground under my feet solidify in a way it hadn't in weeks. This was the 4th spike, the final drop of truth, and it came not in private whispers, but under the harsh symmetry of corporate lighting, with witnesses and logs and timestamps that did not bend to his version of events. Peter's voice softened. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have told you sooner." I nodded once, the motion small controlled. "You did now," I answered, and it was the first thing that felt true in this building. Behind me, the glass doors parted with a soft whoosh as someone else entered, bringing a rush of cooler air that brushed the back of my neck. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see my reflection in the lobby glass, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes clearer than they had been in a long time. The reflection didn't look like someone confused anymore. It looked like someone cornered into clarity. I slid my phone from my pocket, opened the photo app, and took a picture of the access log on Peter's screen when he turned it back on at my request, capturing the highlighted line, the ref A19, the time, the badge ID. A preserved fact, a fracture made permanent. I thanked him quietly, then stepped back, giving us both room to breathe. The lobby returned to motion around us, but the air felt irrevocably altered. The light that had once only trembled over Mark's false calm now illuminated his cruelty with surgical precision. The light on his cheek burns deeper than any apology could reach. The metallic shadow stretched long behind him as he stood near the back entrance of the building, the dull steel frame of the service door casting an elongated silhouette that clung to the concrete like a second, darker version of him, one he could no longer separate himself from. We were alone now, away from the bright symmetry of the lobby, where the truth had first split open, beneath the weight of Peter's voice. Here, under the muted glow of an industrial wall light, every detail felt stripped of pretense, the faint scrape of wind along the dumpsters, the distant hum of traffic beyond the alley, the way Mark's breathing hitched just enough to reveal the fear he didn't know how to hide. I stepped forward slowly, feeling the rough concrete under my shoes, the chill of the night settling against my skin, as though the air itself understood what needed to happen here. My pulse remained steady, not out of calm, but clarity. The truth had crystallized in the lobby, and now it demanded its due. The metallic shadow behind him flickered slightly when he shifted his stance, as if reacting to the fracture of his own composure. He looked at me with a mixture of defensiveness and something raw, something close to panic, though he tried to bury it beneath the familiar mask he had worn for months. "Claire," he said, voice strained, "you're misunderstanding everything." "Whatever Peter told you," I lifted my hand, silencing him, with nothing more than the smallest gesture. The air tightened. "I'm not here to debate," I said quietly, each word measured deliberate. He swallowed his jaw working as he tried to hold the pieces of his argument together, but everything he might have said had already been dismantled by the timestamps, the logs, the witnesses, the receipts. I stepped closer, the narrow overhead light casting us both into a half shadow, and saw the way his gaze darted toward the exit behind me, an instinctive search for escape. But there was nothing left to run from, except the truth he'd crafted himself. "You lied about where you were the night she collapsed." I continued the words sharp, but not raised. "You lied about the call. You lied about the meeting. You lied about the funeral, about the timesheet, about the bank withdrawals, about all of it." My voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. The metallic shadow behind him seemed to thicken, darken, stretching across the wall like a stain cast into physical form. He took a breath as though preparing a rebuttal, but nothing came. The silence between us grew heavier, filling the space with the weight of every truth he'd tried to bury. I thought of my mother, her soft voice, her tired hands, the way she'd looked for me as the monitors beeped in their final uneven rhythm. I thought of the call I hadn't answered in time, the voicemail I kept, the one that broke me for weeks. I thought of him, drink in hand, laughing about the quiet he expected her death to bring. "You made me believe I'd failed her." I said the words steady, carved from a place where grief and clarity met. "You let me carry the guilt, while you celebrated the inconvenience ending." His face contorted, shame, anger, desperation all tangled together, but he still said nothing. Maybe he knew there was nothing to say. Maybe he finally understood that the truth didn't require his confession. It already stood between us, complete and undeniable. In that narrow strip of dim light, I watched the last of his excuses fall apart. Not with a sound, but with a silence so sharp, it cut cleaner than any shouted argument ever could. I stepped even closer until the shadow behind him touched the toe of my shoe, merging for a brief moment before bending away again. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, his darkness brushing mine, then recoiling, unable to claim me anymore. "I'm done," I said softly, not whispered, not shaking, but solid. "There's no version of this where we move forward." The words didn't strike him like a blow. They landed like a verdict that had always been coming, even if he'd convinced himself otherwise. His shoulders sagged, the last of his performative composure collapsing inward. Claire. But whatever apology he reached for died before it made it past his lips. Apologies require remorse, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't remorse, it was fear. Fear of exposure, fear of consequence, fear of the truth catching him where it could no longer be redirected or softened. He dragged a hand through his hair, pacing once, then turning back to face me, the metallic shadow shifting behind him like something restless. "You don't understand how hard things were," he began, but his voice cracked mid-sentence, not with emotion, but with the strain of inventing a justification where none existed. I shook my head slowly. "Hard for you," I echoed, letting the words hang between us like a challenge he could not meet. "She was dying, and you were tired. I was grieving, and you were restless. I was losing the only parent I had left, and you were losing patience." His face twisted, shame burning under his skin, but still he didn't deny it. Couldn't deny it. The truth was a weight he finally felt pressing down with the ruthless precision of justice delivered in quiet, measured breaths. For the first time since she passed, I felt the ground shift, not from loss, but from the clarity of stepping free from someone who had built his comfort on my pain. I stepped backward once, then again, giving the space back to its emptiness. The metallic shadow stretched farther as he instinctively stepped into the overhead light, and something about the sight, his silhouette warped against the steel frame, felt like the final image of this version of him, the last I would ever carry. I didn't tell him goodbye. I didn't tell him I hoped he learned something. I didn't tell him anything. I simply turned, letting the night air brush cool and clean against my face as I stepped into the open. The shadow behind him shrinks as though retreating from the truth left standing. The night air felt strangely open as I stepped onto the porch, the coolness settling against my skin in a way that felt neither harsh nor comforting, simply honest. Present tense returned to me as naturally as breath, as if my body knew that this last part of the story belonged not to memory, but to the moment unfolding now. The cigarette ash at the edge of the railing trembles in a thin, fragile line before dropping soundlessly into the dark, its fall soft enough to vanish before I can track where it lands. I don't smoke, not really. Not in any consistent way, but tonight the lit cigarette belonged more to the air than to me, burning down slowly, releasing small threads of smoke that coil upward before dissolving into the quiet. I watch the ash fall again, a second fragile drop, then another. Each one feels like a punctuation mark in a sentence that has taken far too long to finish. The street lamp at the end of the walkway glows with a steady, unwavering light, no tremble, no flicker, no strained hum. The reflection it casts along the pavement is whole, smooth, unbroken nothing, like the fractured shards of light that followed me for weeks. I exhale slowly, letting the smoke drift from my lips, watching how it lifts into the air before dispersing entirely. The house behind me is silent, the walls no longer pressing in, no longer holding secrets in their corners. The quiet feels earned now, not threatened. I lean forward, resting both hands on the porch railing, the wood cool beneath my palms, and watch the faint circle of light cast onto the steps. The night carries no tremor, no warning, no distortion. For the first time in a long time, it simply exists. My thoughts drift not backward toward Mark, but toward myself, toward the shape of the woman who began this story under trembling light and fractured reflection. I think about the mirror shard in part 2, the receipt with the wrong timestamp, the half-open drawer, the flickering bulb, the trembling key, the smeared reflections on the rainy floor. I think about how each moment tried to show me something I wasn't ready to see. And now standing here, present tense, wrapped around me like a final truth, I let myself acknowledge it fully. The reflection settles finally whole again. The street lamp casts a steady glow on the path, illuminating small flecks of gravel that sparkle faintly under the light, like tiny shards of glass, arranged carefully, instead of scattered violently. I feel the difference deep in my chest. The light no longer reveals fractures, only space. Only possibility. Footsteps sound lightly on the path, and I turn to find Evelyn standing near the edge of her porch, her cardigan wrapped loosely around her shoulders, her expression warm and questioning in the dark. "You all right, honey?" she asks softly. The words don't sting. They don't even pull. They settle. I answer. And it surprises me how true it sounds, how the syllables land without strain. She nods in that way older neighbors do when they've seen enough life to understand what people mean, even when they say very little. "You let me know if you need anything," she says, before turning back toward her door, leaving me again in the quiet. I look at the cigarette between my fingers, its ember fading, and let the final bit of ash fall onto the railing before pressing it out gently. I leave it there, symbolic, not careless proof that some endings require seeing the last glow extinguish before stepping fully into the stillness that follows. The porch beneath me feels different now. Not heavier or lighter, just mine. My pulse settles into a slow, even rhythm as I straighten, letting the cool air fill my lungs. A car passes in the distance, its headlights casting brief arcs of brightness along the street before disappearing again. The shadows that remain are soft, harmless. I close my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the street lamp touch my face, letting the night wash over the last of the tension that had lived in my shoulders for too long. When I open them again, the world hasn't changed, but I have. I step back from the railing, the boards creaking lightly beneath my feet, and glance through the glass panel in the door. My reflection meets me there, not fractured or doubled or blurred, just clear. Whole. Present. I touch the wood lightly, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, and for the first time since the story began, I don't feel that subtle tug of unease, that quiet warning. The house behind the door no longer holds contradictions. It holds only me. I inhale deeply, letting the crisp night air fill my lungs, letting the last remnants of doubt fall away like cigarette ash, dissolving into the dark. This chapter of my life ends not with a confrontation or a revelation, but with simplicity, with breath, with clarity, with the steady glow of a street lamp refusing to flicker. I turn away from the door, stepping off the porch and onto the walkway, feeling the gravel shift thoughtfully beneath my shoes. The future doesn't feel foreign. It feels open. And in the unwavering stillness of this moment, the reflection I've been chasing finally comes into focus, unbroken, honest mine. The night holds steady, offering its quiet as a beginning, not an end.